The world holds its breath. It is October 1962. Over the Caribbean Sea, American reconnaissance planes capture grainy black and white images of something terrifying Soviet nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. For 13 days, humanity teeters on the edge of annihilation. In Washington and Moscow, leaders argue, generals push for action, and the fate of the planet hangs in a fragile balance. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the most dangerous moment in human history. It is not just a clash of armies or weapons, but of two worldviews locked in existential struggle. Democracy versus communism. Freedom versus control. A war not fought in trenches, but in shadows, speeches, space, and suspicion. This was the Cold War. It was an age defined not by open battlefields, but by the fear of mushroom clouds rising into the sky, of unseen spies whispering in hotel rooms, of children practicing duck and cover drills under their desks. For nearly half a century, from the ruins of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a conflict unlike any before it. A war where the greatest weapon was not just the bomb, but the idea. To understand this struggle, we must first return to its roots. The Cold War was born not in Cuba, or Berlin, or Vietnam, but in the ashes of World War II. Europe lay devastated. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead, economies shattered. Two superpowers emerged from the carnage, each believing it alone held the key to the future of civilization. The United States, untouched by invasion, stood tall with vast industrial might and the promise of liberal democracy. The Soviet Union, scarred by 20 million dead, carried the memory of its sacrifice and the iron grip of communist ideology. In this new world, geography itself became a weapon. The United States dominated oceans, with fleets patrolling every sea lane. The Soviets commanded a vast land empire, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. But it was not maps alone that shaped the coming conflict. It was culture, politics, and the haunting memory of war. In Washington, leaders vowed never to appease another dictator, never again to allow tyranny to spread unchecked. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin promised that capitalism would not be allowed to encircle and strangle socialism. And so, from the very moment the guns of World War II fell silent, a new kind of war began. A war fought in whispers and walls, in satellites orbiting the heavens, in propaganda posters and midnight arrests. A war of patience where each side tested the other's resolve without ever firing the first, fateful shot that might plunge humanity into nuclear fire. This is not just a story of leaders and missiles. It is a story of people of the American child who practiced hiding beneath a wooden desk, of the Soviet family waiting in bread lines, of soldiers staring across the Berlin Wall at enemies they would never meet. It is the story of an entire generation raised under the shadow of apocalypse. And it begins here, in the uneasy silence after World War II, where old allies became rivals, and the world entered an era of suspicion that would last nearly half a century. The Cold War was not fought on a single battlefield. It was shaped by landscapes, resources, and cultures that stood in stark contrast to one another. On one side of the world, the United States, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was a land of abundance. Skyscrapers towered over New York City, neon lights glittered in Los Angeles, and factories roared in Detroit, producing cars, airplanes, and the consumer goods of a booming middle class. With vast farmland, endless oil reserves, and unrivaled access to global trade routes, America projected an image of prosperity. Its strength came not only from its military, but from its culture of individualism, capitalism, and the promise, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, of opportunity for all. Across the globe, the Soviet Union presented a very different landscape. Spanning 11 time zones, it was the largest nation on Earth, encompassing frozen tundra, endless steppes, dense forests, and industrial heartlands. Its people had endured centuries of hardship, czarist rule, revolution, famine, and invasion. The scars of World War II were still visible: shattered cities, burned villages, and families torn apart. but from these ruins, the Soviet leadership proclaimed a vision of rebirth. The hammer and sickle waved proudly over Moscow, symbolizing the unity of workers and peasants in building a socialist utopia. Heavy industry became the lifeblood of the Soviet state, steel plants, coal mines, and nuclear reactors rising against the gray horizon. Geography was destiny. America, shielded by two oceans, enjoyed security and access to global markets. The Soviet Union, landlocked in many regions and hemmed in by potential enemies, lived with the constant fear of invasion. Twice in the 20th century, foreign armies had marched deep into Russian soil. The memory of Napoleon's advance in the 19th century and Hitler's blitzkrieg in the 20th burned deeply into the Soviet psyche. To the Kremlin, military strength was not a choice, it was survival. Yet beyond territory and industry, culture itself became a battlefield. In America, Hollywood films, jazz music, and Coca-Cola symbolized a lifestyle of leisure and freedom. In Moscow, the state controlled every aspect of cultural life. Posters glorified the worker, statues honored Lenin and Stalin, and children were taught that the future belonged to socialism. To the West, these images seemed like propaganda. To many Soviets, they were a source of pride, a reminder that they were building something entirely new, a society that rejected exploitation and promised equality. Religion played its role. In the United States, Christian values were often linked to the defense of freedom and morality. In the officially atheist Soviet Union, churches were stripped of power, and loyalty to the state replaced loyalty to God. The contrast was not just political, but spiritual, giving the rivalry an almost cosmic dimension: good and evil, light and dark, each defined by the eye of the beholder. And so, the stage was set: two nations, two ideologies, two cultures, each convinced it held the key to the future of humanity. Between them stretched not only oceans and continents, but a chasm of belief that would shape every conflict, every alliance, every whisper of the Cold War. The end of World War II was supposed to mark the dawn of peace. Allied soldiers embraced in the rubble of Berlin, and the world cheered as Nazi tyranny crumbled. Yet even in victory, the seeds of a new conflict had already been planted. For beneath the smiles at conferences and the handshakes of generals, suspicion simmered between East and West. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side against Hitler, but theirs was a marriage of necessity, not trust. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin sat together at Yalta and Potsdam, sketching maps of Europe's future. To the Americans and British, these meetings were about rebuilding democracy and free markets. To Stalin, they were about security, creating a buffer zone of friendly governments to shield the Soviet Union from another invasion. It was in these post-war negotiations that the world began to fracture. While the United States pushed for free elections in Poland and Eastern Europe, Stalin quietly installed communist regimes loyal to Moscow. Red Army troops, still occupying much of Eastern Europe, became both liberators and enforcers. In a matter of years, countries like East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia fell firmly under Soviet control. To Washington, this was the beginning of tyranny spreading across the continent. To Moscow, it was the natural reward for its sacrifice and blood. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech that captured the growing divide. Standing in Missouri, alongside President Harry Truman, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. The phrase would echo for decades, symbolizing the invisible wall separating East and West. Behind it lay the Soviet sphere of influence. Beyond it, the democratic and capitalist nations of the West, led by the United States. The rivalry was not only political, it was technological and psychological. In 1945, America had unveiled the atomic bomb, leveling Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The message was clear: the United States possessed a weapon unlike any other. But in 1949, to the shock of Washington, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. The balance of power shifted instantly. No longer could America rely on nuclear monopoly to ensure dominance. The world had entered the atomic age, and the possibility of mutual destruction became a permanent shadow. As Europe divided, new alliances emerged. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military pact promising to defend one another against Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union built its own alliance in 1955, the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern Europe into a bloc under Moscow's command. Two armed camps now faced each other across the heart of Europe, separated by barbed wire, watchtowers, and ideology. The early Cold War was a game of chess played on a global board. Each move a coup, an election, an alliance was matched by a counter-move. Each side believed the other sought total domination. And so the fragile friendship of wartime gave way to distrust, then rivalry, and finally to the permanent standoff that defined the second half of the 20th century. History is often shaped by ideas, but it is men and their decisions that give those ideas flesh and bone. The Cold War was no exception. From Moscow to Washington, powerful figures rose and fell, each leaving their mark on the conflict that spanned decades. At its beginning stood Joseph Stalin, the iron-willed dictator of the Soviet Union. Thick-mustached, calculating, and suspicious of everyone around him, Stalin believed survival depended on absolute control. He saw enemies not only outside his borders but within them. Under his rule, millions perished in purges, famines, and gulags. Yet he was also the man who had steered the Soviet Union through its bloodiest war, emerging with both vast territory and unmatched prestige. To him, compromise was weakness, and weakness could mean death. In every negotiation with the West, Stalin sought not balance but dominance. Opposite him in Washington was President Harry Truman. Unlike Roosevelt, who had tried to maintain a working relationship with Stalin, Truman was blunt, decisive, and far less patient. He had authorized the atomic bomb against Japan, and he carried that same no-nonsense approach into post-war diplomacy. When Stalin tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, Truman responded with the Truman Doctrine, an open commitment to defend free nations against communist expansion. It was a bold line in the sand, and it transformed America into the self-declared defender of the free world. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union entered a new chapter. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was a man of contradictions. Bombastic, emotional, and unpredictable, he pounded his shoe on the desk at the United Nations, shocking diplomats with his theatrics. Yet beneath the bluster was a leader who dreamed of proving communism's superiority not only on Earth, but in space. It was Khrushchev who launched Sputnik in 1957, igniting the space race, and who placed missiles in Cuba, bringing the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. In the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower emerged as a stabilizing figure. A war hero turned president, Eisenhower understood both the dangers of overreaction and the necessity of strength. He warned against the rise of the military-industrial complex, even as he expanded America's nuclear arsenal and covert operations. His calm demeanor reassured a nervous public, but his policies ensured that the Cold War would remain global in scope. The story of leaders continued across decades, John F. Kennedy facing Khrushchev in Berlin and Cuba, Lyndon Johnson wrestling with Vietnam, Richard Nixon opening the door to China to outmaneuver Moscow, Ronald Reagan declaring the Soviet Union an evil empire even as he later shook hands with Mikhail Gorbachev, the reformer who would change the Soviet Union forever. These leaders were not just politicians, they were symbols. Stalin embodied the ruthless power of authoritarianism, Truman the resolve of American democracy, Khrushchev the volatility of the nuclear age, Kennedy the youthful hope and fear of a new generation, Reagan the conviction that the Cold War could be won, and Gorbachev the man who dared to loosen the chains of communism, not knowing it would bring the entire system crashing down. Their decisions, their words, their mistakes and triumphs, these shaped the destiny of millions. The Cold War was not an accident of history. It was a contest driven by personalities as much as by policies, a drama where the stakes were nothing less than the future of humanity. Every great struggle leaves behind monuments not always carved in stone, but in steel, concrete, and the imagination of entire nations. The Cold War, though rarely fought in open battle, produced symbols that came to define the 20th century. Perhaps the most visible of these was the Berlin Wall. In 1961, under orders from Nikita Khrushchev and East German leaders, concrete slabs and barbed wire rose overnight, cutting through the heart of Berlin. Families were divided, neighbors separated, and a city once free to move now stood split in two. For the West, the wall was the ultimate symbol of communist oppression, a physical scar across Europe. For the East, it was portrayed as a protective barrier against Western spies and saboteurs. For decades, the wall stood as the most recognizable monument of the Cold War until the night it finally crumbled in 1989. But not all monuments were built on the ground. Some soared into the heavens. In 1957, a metallic sphere with 4 antennae beeped its way across the sky. Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, launched by the Soviet Union, it shocked the world. For Americans, the idea that Moscow had beaten them into space was a humiliation, a warning that communism could outpace capitalism in science and technology. For the Soviets, it was a triumphant declaration that socialism could reach the stars. The space race had begun, and it would inspire everything from classrooms teaching advanced math and physics to children staring at the night sky, dreaming of astronauts and cosmonauts. Nuclear weapons themselves became grim monuments to this rivalry. Underground test sites in Nevada and Kazakhstan turned deserts into wastelands. Hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima were detonated with mushroom clouds stretching into the stratosphere. The sheer scale of destruction became both a source of pride and paralyzing fear. Entire cities were designed with fallout shelters, warning sirens, and evacuation plans. Governments commissioned chilling films teaching citizens how to survive nuclear blasts. The weapon was not just military, it was psychological, shaping how generations lived, learned, and even dreamed. Yet culture became a weapon. Hollywood produced films celebrating American freedom and warning of communist infiltration, while the Soviet Union funded ballets, operas, and cinema to showcase the supposed superiority of socialist values. Jazz music, carried by American musicians across the globe, became an unexpected ambassador of freedom, while Soviet posters depicted workers and peasants as heroes of the future. Even sporting arenas became battlefields like the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow, boycotted by the United States, and the Miracle on Ice hockey game, where American amateurs stunned the world by defeating the mighty Soviet team. Every achievement carried weight far beyond itself. A rocket was not just a rocket, it was proof of which system could inspire genius. A gold medal was not just a victory, it was a symbol of ideological supremacy. Even a concrete wall was more than stone, it was a line drawn in the soul of humanity, dividing not just land but belief, hope, and identity. The Cold War's monuments were not simply relics of power. They were reminders that the struggle between America and the Soviet Union touched every corner of life on Earth, in space, and in the hearts of the people who lived beneath its shadow. For most people, the Cold War was not played out in war rooms or summit meetings. It was lived day by day in classrooms, on city streets, in the quiet fear that tomorrow might never come. In the United States, the booming prosperity of the post-war era was shadowed by constant reminders of danger. Suburban neighborhoods sprouted like fields of identical houses, each with white picket fences and shiny new cars in the driveway. Families gathered around televisions, watching sitcoms and baseball, but they also watched public service films teaching children to duck and cover in case of nuclear attack. Civil defense drills became routine. Sirens wailed across towns, and children crouched beneath wooden desks, hands over their heads, believing naively that this would save them from atomic fire. Fear also seeped into politics and society. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy launched a campaign to root out alleged communists in government, Hollywood, and even universities. Careers were destroyed, friendships torn apart, and suspicion became a way of life. At the same time, consumer culture flourished. American supermarkets overflowed with goods, from canned soup to televisions, embodying the promise of capitalism. For many Americans, abundance itself became proof that their system was superior to Soviet austerity. Across the Iron Curtain, life looked very different. In the Soviet Union, the day began not with choice, but with scarcity. Long queues formed outside shops where families waited hours for bread, sugar, or shoes. Apartments in vast concrete housing blocks, gray, uniform, and cramped, became the backdrop of daily existence. Yet there was also pride in victory over fascism, pride in Sputnik, pride in being part of a system that promised equality, even if reality often fell short. Children in the Soviet Union were taught from an early age that they were soldiers in a global struggle. In schools, portraits of Lenin looked down from classroom walls, and lessons emphasized loyalty to the state. Young pioneers, the communist equivalent of the Boy Scouts, wore red scarves and pledged devotion to socialism. Where American children dreamed of astronauts, Soviet children dreamed of cosmonauts, their heroes celebrated in parades and songs. Religion, too, reflected daily division. In America, churches overflowed on Sundays, and "In God We Trust" was added to currency as a symbolic stand against atheistic communism. In the Soviet Union, churches stood empty or were repurposed, while faith in the state and its ideology replaced faith in God. Yet even under repression, many quietly held on to spiritual traditions, lighting candles in secret or whispering prayers at home. Beyond politics and scarcity, there were moments of simple human similarity. Young people on both sides listened to music, fell in love, dreamed of a better future. American teenagers danced to Elvis Presley, while Soviet youth secretly tuned radios to catch forbidden Western jazz or rock and roll. Even in the strictest states, culture found ways to slip through borders, reminding the world that ordinary people were not so different after all. For millions, the Cold War was not about ideology, but about the constant tension between fear and hope: fear of war, hope for peace; fear of control, hope for freedom. It was life lived under a shadow, yet still full of laughter, love, and the small rituals that made survival possible. The Cold War was never a single conflict. It was a chain of crises, proxy wars, and moments when the world trembled on the brink. From the Korean Peninsula to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Afghanistan to the streets of Berlin, the struggle between East and West erupted again and again, never directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, but always in the lives of millions caught in between. In Korea, the Cold War turned hot. In 1950, North Korean troops, backed by Moscow and later Beijing, surged across the 38th parallel. The United States and its allies rushed to defend the South. For 3 years, soldiers fought in freezing mountains and muddy rice fields until the war ended in stalemate. The message was clear: neither superpower would yield, and both were willing to fight through others. Vietnam brought the lesson home with even greater cost. What began as American support for South Vietnam spiraled into a full-scale war, pitting U.S. firepower against guerrilla fighters supported by the Soviets and Chinese. Villages burned, jungles echoed with helicopters and gunfire, and American society fractured under the weight of casualties and protest. For Washington, it was a painful reminder that military might could not always secure ideological victory. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union faced its own Vietnam and Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet troops marched in to prop up a friendly regime. They expected a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a decade-long war against Afghan guerrillas armed with U.S.-supplied weapons. Coffins returned home in secret, morale collapsed, and faith in the Soviet system began to crack. Beyond the battlefields, crises brought the world to the edge of catastrophe. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly unleashed nuclear war. In 1968, the Prague Spring showed how far Moscow would go to crush dissent within its empire. In 1983, a NATO exercise called Able Archer was mistaken by Soviet intelligence as a possible first strike, almost triggering a nuclear response. Again and again, luck and caution narrowly saved humanity from destruction. But no empire lasts forever. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced deepening problems. Its economy stagnated, its people grew restless, and its leaders aged while the world changed around them. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, a reformer who dared to speak of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. He sought to save socialism by loosening control, but instead unleashed forces too powerful to contain. Eastern Europe erupted in protest. The Berlin Wall, that great monument of division, fell in 1989 as crowds surged through its cracks. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the Cold War ended without a final battle. Its legacy still echoes today. NATO endures. Russia, the heir to the Soviet Union, still rivals the West. Nuclear weapons remain in silos, a reminder of how close we once came to annihilation. The space race gave us satellites, global communication, and dreams of Mars. The Cold War shaped our borders, our culture, our technology, and our fears. For nearly half a century, humanity lived with the shadow of the bomb, the whisper of spies, the weight of walls. The Cold War was more than a rivalry between nations, it was the story of a planet held hostage by ideology, ambition, and fear. And though the wall has fallen and the Soviet Union is gone, its echoes remind us, history is never truly past. It lives on in the choices we make and in the fragile hope that we never return to the edge of midnight again.